My name is Doug Langworthy. I'm the translator of these Henry VI plays. When Louis asked me to translate these, I said, oh, translate Shakespeare. I don't know about that. I sat down with it for a while, and I found that it just kind of came very easily to me. One of the things that made this play so accessible to me is that these are early plays. These are plays when he's still figuring things out. He's still figuring out what it is to write a history play. The language was already in his plays very accessible and very modern. So I would say probably 40% of the text that you're going to be reading is original Shakespeare. Louis told us early on, if it's not broken, don't fix it. At first, do no harm. So if something is already accessible and modern in our ears, just leave it. So then it was up to me to take the rest of the text that had, say, archaic syntax, archaic words that we don't understand, words that we think we understand that mean something different, things that feel old like these and thous, changing those to yous. Those were the kinds of things that I worked on. I want to thank you also for helping me with the scansion. I've really kept the verse. These plays are mostly done in verse, except for the Cade Rebellion, when we're hanging out with the workmen. There's a lot more of that is in prose, but it all should scan pretty well, so help me out there. Also, I found using contractions also helped a lot. You know, nowadays we don't always say I am this. You know, she was doing that. I mean, we contract things a lot. That helped me a lot with the scansion. I would love you to listen in. All of these plays have been already workshopped in Colorado, actually. But if things stick out to you, either as being too contemporary or too archaic, those are the things that I would love to have us flag. We don't have time to go back and do a major deconstruction of the translation, but those are the kinds of small things that I want to be focusing in on and cueing into if you guys have suggestions about that. I actually have an example at the end of the research packet on the last page. Just so that you can spend some time looking at what I've done. This is a Queen Margaret speech from Part 2, Act 1, Scene 3. Who is Margaret in right there? Okay. As I was re-looking at this for today, I've actually found a word that I want to change back to the original to show you that this is still in process. In the fourth line, the third and the fourth line, which in my translation says, should King Henry still be a mere pupil under the oppressive eye of Gloucester? I looked back at the original and saw the word surly, and I thought, now that's a great word. Why did I change that? So I would like to go back to, instead of oppressive, to the word surly, under the surly eye of Gloucester. So those are the kinds of things that we're still fine-tuning. In terms of why we're doing this and who we're doing this for, whenever I'm translating, I'm always thinking of my audience. Who is my audience? What are their ears attuned to? Early on in this process, I was talking about this with my stepfather, who loves Shakespeare, but is one of those smart, educated people who sits in Shakespeare and for the first 20 minutes really has problems with, I don't know that word, I don't know that word, I'm being pulled out a little bit. And so he, in fact, is my intended audience. I've given him samples of what I've done, and he's just over the moon about this. My mom and stepfather are actually coming to the readings. But so that's my intended audience, a theater goer who hasn't been trained in Shakespeare, who hasn't read all the footnotes. But I want these plays to still sound like Shakespeare. That's why that 40% of the original language, basically what I'm trying to do is take the lines that have that archaic stuff and match them to the language that Shakespeare's already using that's already modern, so that we're bringing Shakespeare in line with himself. So it's a blending of me, but it's me trying to put on that voice of Shakespeare that already sounds accessible and modern. So I hope when you read these, you don't feel like you're in a contemporary world. you're in a modern world, and Shakespeare already invented that modern language. These plays come from the early part of Shakespeare's career, the 1590s. Some people say he wrote parts 2 and 3 first, and then went back and added part 1 as a prequel. Some people say that there was an existing Talbot play that he added his material into to kind of set it up as a prequel. Some people say part 1 was written with another playwright. Nobody really knows, but I think those things are kind of interesting. Shakespeare's young at this point. He's what we would call today an emerging playwright. He's still finding his voice. So in these plays, you can tell that he is figuring out what it means to write a history play, what it means for Shakespeare to write a history play. There were some history plays written before Shakespeare, but they were more in the line of morality tales. He is the one who goes back to the Chronicles and writes from them and really is interested in putting history into the plays, but of course, making it dramatic. So as we go through the work at the table today, we'll often find if we go back to the real history, Shakespeare has played around with it. Time gets compressed, events get compressed. He's playing a little bit, sometimes fast and loose, with the actual facts in order to make the dramatic arc work. These plays are popular plays. He's trying to establish himself as a playwright, so they're very plot-driven. They have very vivid characters. I say every character has 1 or 2 qualities. They get that across the minute they step on stage. The language is accessible. There's less what I call verbal density in these plays that you have in the later plays, where it's more complicated thoughts, more poetry. This is much more direct. He puts in popular elements like witchcraft. There's witchcraft in part 1 with Joan of Arc. There's witchcraft in part 2 with Eleanor. The women in all of these plays are extremely strong characters. Joan of Arc in part 1, Eleanor in part 2. You don't want to mess around with Eleanor. And Margaret, of course, is the largest female role he will ever write. She's somebody who goes into battle with armor on, so you're not going to mess around with her either. These 3 plays lead right into Richard III. So we think of this Henry VI trilogy as a trilogy. It's really a tetralogy, that Richard III just springboards right after part 3. He just ramps up that character to the point that he's got to release him into a play. The trilogy, they're really ensemble plays. They're not driven by a singular character. I say he's figuring out how to write a history play. By the time he gets to Richard III, that's a play that's dominated by a central character who just takes up all the time. These plays are ensemble plays, and I think that's part of the fun of them. Everybody plays a role in these plays. Everybody thinks they're right, and that's where the conflict comes from. I have fun working on these and seeing, again, he's a beginning playwright, seeds of things that he'll develop later. The Cade Rebellion and the tradesmen who are part of that rebellion are early drafts of the mechanicals, definitely, in Midsummer. The witchcraft, leads us eventually to Macbeth. He also starts exploring the soliloquy. And in fact, there's the main long soliloquy that Richard has in part 3 is the longest soliloquy that Shakespeare will ever write. And that, again, leads him right into Richard III. That's Richard just ramping himself up and getting ready for that play. So then I thought I'd talk just a little bit about the historical context and what happens over the arc of these 3 plays, what happens in each of the plays. So the plays are concerned with this question of how and why did England lose France after Henry V. And it's hard to remember that the Henry IV plays and the Henry V and Richard II are all written later. They're written after these plays. Chronologically, they come before. So we can carry our knowledge of Henry V and what that character accomplished for England, which we know from Henry V. can carry him as a character into this play. There was some idea that maybe the French had the benefit of witchcraft, that Joan of Arc was a witch, and that's one of the reasons why they lost France. But I think what Shakespeare's really into is the idea of the internal squabbles in England. And once Henry wasn't there to unite the country behind this foreign cause, all of those internal squabblings came to the fore, and that's the reason why they actually lost France. Their eye wasn't on the prize anymore. It was about, I want to be in power, no, I want to be in power. Henry VI was crowned at 9 months old. So as soon as his father dies, you have this power vacuum in the country. And that's where all of the rivalry comes from, all of the question of who's legitimately entitled to have the crown. And that discussion happens at many times in these plays, and I think Shakespeare sort of presents the Yorkist side. We're derived from the third son of Edward III. And the Lancaster side, we're derived from the fourth, but you guys were derived via the women, and we come down from the men. So that's why we have a more legitimate claim. And it's like he's presenting them without coming down on one side necessarily or the other, which I think is interesting. So here's a basic summary of what happens in each of the parts of the play. We started part 1 yesterday. Part 1 begins with the funeral of Henry V. So Henry VI's father has just died, and they're burying him. The cycle ends with the death of Henry VI. So really, these 3 parts tell the story of Henry VI and the power vacuum that happened under him. We start out with already, once Henry's gone, the messengers come right in and say, we're losing all these towns. We're already starting to lose France. There's a saying that goes around at this time that everything that was gained under Henry V gets lost under Henry VI. So that's kind of the arc of the play. In part 1, we have the genesis of the actual War of the Roses. So all this squabbling between the Yorks and the Lancasters gets named the War of the Roses. He actually creates a scene where people start pulling roses off of rose bushes and saying, I'm on the red side, I'm on the white side. They pick teams, so to speak. That's one thing that's always fun to figure out with any of your characters is which side am I on? Am I on the white rose with the Yorks or the red rose with the Lancasters? I think it's interesting that Genesis scene, which is not historical, that he's created, takes place in the garden outside the court. So it's in a garden. Genesis, the garden. The garden comes back in these plays. There's several other scenes that are set in a garden. I think that's...
Do you know if Shakespeare was the first person to coin the term War of the Roses?
I don't think so. I think that was already there. But he created a scene in his play that justified actually picking roses off of a rose bush. I think the roses were already part of the heraldry, but he created that scene where he made it literal. So Henry VI, we find out, is being ruled over. Because he's a boy, he can't actually rule the country. So he has a protector named Gloucester, who is in competition with his uncle Winchester. So these plays, starting in part 1, are setting up these bitter rivalries between different sides. And these rivalries are what fuel the plays. There's a rivalry between York and Somerset on both sides of that white rose and the red rose. And then part 1, each of the first 2 plays introduces a new character at the end that leads us into the next play. So at the end of part 1, Margaret is introduced. She is wooed by Suffolk in this brilliant scene that, as we read it yesterday, it's actually a very funny scene. Could be out of a romantic comedy, a rom-com, where Suffolk is going into these asides where he's so unsure about how he's supposed to approach her, and she keeps saying, why aren't you telling me my answer to my question? He keeps going off into his aside, then he comes back with his answer to her, and she goes off into her asides, and it's just hilarious. Part two, again, is about the loss of France. By Henry VI marrying Margaret, there's a symbol in that marriage of losing France, because as part of the marriage contract, they have to give back to her father, Renier, the provinces of Anjou and Maine, who were originally his counties. So by marrying her, we're already giving things up. The War of the Roses really ramps up under Part 2. There's a repetition of the genealogical claims to the crown that was in Part 1 with Mortimer, where he goes through, I call it the Ancestry.com moment, where he's literally going through whose father derived from whom, who has the legitimate right. That discussion happens in all three of the plays, so no matter sort of when you enter into the play, you're going to get that discussion. We see in that play the demise of these two strong characters of Gloucester, the protector, who is murdered, and Suffolk, who is also murdered. We see the rise of Margaret as a real political power player. She's right there with the rest of them. She's often telling him, don't come into battle with us. It's better when you're not around. Let me put on my armor and go in and take care of this. Part 2, we have the popular rebellion of Jack Cade, instigated by Richard Plantagenet on the York side. He's trying to stir up the populace to get advantage over the king. And then at the very end of Part 2, I said they often introduce characters that launch us into the next part. We're introduced to York's sons, Edward, who becomes Edward IV, and Richard, who becomes Richard III. So they're introduced in Part 2, and then they're unleashed in Part 3. So in Part 3, we have the complete loss of France, and all the battles have to do now with the War of the Roses, with this internal English squabbling. There's a literal fight over the crown in this, which goes back and forth between Henry VI and Edward IV. It switches, I think, about 4 times in the play. So in all of these readings, we're going to have an actual crown, and the crown will go back and forth in Part 3 between the two of them. We have the rise of the House of York and the rise of Richard III. Again, that's going to launch us into Richard III. We have the death of Henry VI, and then Margaret gets sent back to France. So Margaret's story is also a major through line through the 3 plays, and she gets sent back to France at the end. What's interesting is that King Henry VIII, after Richard III, his father is Henry VII, who is a Lancaster. His mother is from the House of York. So Henry VIII combines the 2 houses, the 2 squabbling houses from the War of the Roses. And his daughter Elizabeth, who is the current monarch in this Shakespeare's time, comes out of the end of the War of the Roses. So by the time we get to Elizabeth, this squabbling has ended, but it's still, the question of legitimacy is a big question because Elizabeth doesn't have any children. So what's going to happen when she leaves? I think that's why the War of the Roses was interesting and on people's minds. What's going to happen to us when Elizabeth is dead?